Hi, I'm Aaron Brody at the Badè Museum at Pacific School of Religion. And I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series of new perspectives on ancient Nubia. But before we get to today's talk, I'd like to introduce Jess Johnson, who is our assistant curator and a graduate student at UC Berkeley. Jess, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. We would like to start by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. There is no question that our society is poised at a moment of change. We see it when fellow Americans are unjustly detained, when our citizens are wrongly harmed, and when our communities are in the streets for months on end protesting in order to be heard. The Badè Museum of Biblical Archaeology and the Archaeological Research Facility, ARF, at UC Berkeley wish to acknowledge the pain and outrage for our community members who bear the weight of existing in a society designed to work against them and feel the devastation most keenly. Here at the museum and at ARF, we have been moved by the courage of those who are most deeply affected and the tenacity of those protesting for change. The Badè Museum and ARF stand in solidarity with the African American community. We join you in your calls for justice. Collectively and individually, our staff condemns the police brutality and systematic racism that has long been enacted against the Black community and other communities of color. It has persisted for far too long. It has resulted in the unjust and premature ending of lives. So let us say their names. Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Let us as organizations be perfectly clear. Black lives matter. We lend our thoughts and actions to those who every day actively work to make this statement a living, breathing ideal, and to those who continually live the reality of racial injustice. Likewise, we lend our expertise to the cause of incorporating BLM sensitive material into our exhibits, our programming, and our curriculum. We know very well that this moment has been a long time coming, and we are in the fight for equality, justice, and accountability. Through this lecture series, we aim to raise awareness on ancient Nubia, a vibrant region in Northeast Africa with a rich archaeological and historical legacy. Learning about the ancient peoples of Nubia is one way to decenter the usual academic focus on Egypt and biblical and classical lands in order to reconceptualize our past. Decolonizing our views of the past, as through the research presented in the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series, we hope will lend to a more just and equitable future. Thank you and enjoy the lecture.
Thanks, Jess. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Salim Faraji, who is professor and former chair of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is the founding executive director of the Masters of Arts in International Studies Africa program at Concordia University, Irvine, located in Ghana, West Africa. He completed his Master's of Divinity at the Claremont School of Theology and MA and PhD at Claremont Graduate University. He is a member of the International Society for Nubian Studies and specializes in early Christian history, Africana and Africanist historiography, Coptic studies, and the Kerma, Napatan, Meroitic, and medieval periods of Nubian history. Dr. Faraji is also a founding member of the Nubian Language Society and one of a handful of Nubiologists in the United States, and the only Africana Studies scholar in the country who is also a Coptic studies specialist. Professor Faraji is a contributor to publications in Romans, Barbarians, and the Transformation of the Roman World, the Encyclopedia of African Religions, the Oxford Dictionary of African Biography, and is the sole author of his monograph, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. Today, Dr. Faraji will present The Ascendancy of the Kushite Kingdom of Kerma in the Post-Middle Kingdom Era, revisiting the Second Intermediate Period of ancient Egypt. Welcome, Dr. Faraji, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me first extend gratitude to the Pacific School of Religion, the Badè Museum, and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley for extending this invitation to give this lecture on ancient Nubia. Very quickly, I'm going to pull up my screen here. All right. As Dr. Brody said, the ascendancy of the Kushite kingdom of Kerma in the post-Middle Kingdom era, revisiting the second intermediate period of ancient Egypt. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the Africana intellectual tradition in the study of Nile Valley civilizations. I also want to thank the organizers of this lecture series for their uncompromising statement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, in solidarity with the movement of Black lives, in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of what we now call California, and in solidarity with the decolonizing scholarship and research, in particular in Egyptology, Nubiology, and in other disciplines. Let me just say very quickly, 2 years ago, the former president of the African Studies Association, which is an international organization of Africanist scholars, Dr. Jean Allman, gave a presidential lecture in 2018. In that presidential lecture, she emphatically made it clear that African-American scholars and other scholars of the African diaspora were and are the founders of African studies in the United States. She even suggested that the famous Herkovitz Award, which is a prestigious award in the African Studies Association, be renamed to a prominent African-American intellectual by the name of Dr. William Leo Hansberry. Not only that, even in the discipline of Egyptology, my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Davies, is also doing work looking at the Africana or the African-American intellectual tradition and its contributions to the discipline of Egyptology. So here I'm acknowledging the pioneers in the Africana intellectual tradition as a way for us to think about parallel traditions and parallel perspectives and viewpoints that have always existed side by side with traditional quote unquote establishment disciplines. So here we see the original cover of a publication, Nile Valley Civilizations, edited by Dr. Ivan van Sertima, a prominent Africanist and anthropologist, scholar of antiquity, originally from Guyana in South America, I'm sorry. And this proceedings was a part of the Nile Valley Civilizations Proceedings Conference in Atlanta, September 26th to the 30th, 1984. A preeminent Nile Valley conference hosted by African-American and African diasporic scholars. Earlier that year, in February 1984, in Southern California in Los Angeles, an organization called the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations was also founded in the same year and established the first annual Ancient Egyptian Studies Conference. ASCAC is an organization that still is in existence and is still active and committed to scholarship in the ancient Nile Valley, Egypt, Sudan, as well as the Horn of Africa as well, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, and so forth. So these are scholars, just very quick, I think it's appropriate to say their names. Beginning in the early 19th century, scholars of the African diaspora and African Americans have always had an interest in the Nile Valley. So Martin Delany, Edward Woolman Blyden, George Washington Williams, Antonio Furman, Drusilla Dungy Houston, W.B. Du Bois, William Leo Hansberry, Carter G. Woodson, John Henry Clark, Shekin Diop, Theophilo Obenga, Jacob Carruthers, Malana Karenga, Renoka Rashidi, Charles Finch, Ivan Van Sertima, Yosef Ben Chikanen, among many others. So I think it's important for me to establish that the presentation that you all will see this afternoon, I'm indebted to this intellectual tradition. Many of these scholars, not all of them have passed, some of them are still alive, especially the latter ones I named, and I have been mentored and guided by many of these scholars in my study of ancient Nile Valley civilizations. I would like for us to actually begin at the end, so to speak. I'm looking at the role of ancient Kush, Kerma civilization, and ancient Nubia in general in the influence of the Nile Valley between the 13th and 17th dynasties, the second intermediate period in particular, in ancient Egyptian history. But actually what I will cover will actually extend really from the first intermediate period really up until the second intermediate period. And I use this particular slide as a way for us to begin to look at some of the themes that were going on in Nile Valley history at this particular time. Certainly the rise of ancient Kush and ancient Kerma. You know, we have, as of late, heard notions of Nubian or Black pharaohs or Black pharaohs in the 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt, or somehow ancient Egypt was a civilization that was not African, meaning not Black, and then somehow the Nubians were a Black civilization. We're going to flush all that out this afternoon. But also the notion that the only time, which is an error and a misperception, but the only time that Nubians or the Kushites came to prominence in the Nile Valley was the 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt. But what we will see this afternoon is that the Kerma kingdom, basically the Kerma kingdom from a period of 2500 BCE to 1500 BCE was a prominent power in the Nile Valley that contended with Egypt and for a short time held sway over Egypt as well. So we look at this particular inscription, Sobeknakh of the 17th dynasty. 17th dynasty is late second intermediate period, also at the very beginning of what will become the New Kingdom. Sobeknakh is a local governor of a town called El Kab. In the Egyptian language is Nekheb in Upper Egypt. The patron deity or goddess of this particular city was the goddess Nekhebet. We will see that in these tombs, this particular image of Sobeknakh painted tomb was discovered by British Egyptologist William Vivian Davies. It's dated to around 1575 to 1550 BCE. This was a crucial transitional period in Egypt's history when a native dynasty centered at Thebes in Upper Egypt was engaged in a war of independence against a foreign Canaanite dynasty, the so-called Hyksos or Hekakasuk, who were based at Avaris in the Nile Delta and controlled Lower Egypt. Only a handful of these type of tombs have survived, and Sobeknakh tomb is the best preserved. In 2003, London Times, the Times, put out this controversial and sensational headline in the UK, in their newspaper. Tomb reveals ancient Egypt's humiliating secret. And what was this humiliating secret that had been hidden from us or concealed and so forth? Our correspondents report on how details of a crushing defeat by another Nile superpower was kept hidden. Who was this other Nile superpower that Sobeknakh had talked about? He left this inscription in his tomb of his battles against the Kushite kingdom, but not only the Kushite kingdom, but a Kushite alliance and federation. He says, "Listen, you who are alive upon the earth, vile Kush came, aroused along his length. He having stirred up the tribes of Wawats, that is Lower Nubia, the island dwellers of Kent Hanefer, Punt, and the Magi. The Sobeknak inscription describes a Kushite-led alliance that indicates polities from Lower Nubia, even as far as Punt, which is believed to be the Horn of Africa, what is now Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, and the Magi people in the eastern desert of the Nile Valley. We must consider the political influence and range of Kush as a formidable power in the Nile Valley that possessed the authority and resources to launch an offensive on Egypt in concert with other regional powers. There's a map, of course, to the right of the Nile Valley. Of course, northern Egypt, lower Egypt touching the Mediterranean, upper Egypt to the south, lower Nubia, which borders southern Egypt or upper Egypt, and then, of course, upper Nubia, which is the heart of the Kushite Empire in the region of the fourth and fifth cataracts. I also want to begin with laying out the paradigm and perspective of my approach to the Nile Valley in general and ancient Kush and Nubia in particular. A Nubiological perspective of ancient Nile Valley history, one that privileges the southern pole of classical Nile Valley civilization and its historic polity, the Kerma kingdom of Kush, contains notions of ancient Egyptian preeminence. Consequently, the traditional periodization of the post-Middle Kingdom era in ancient Egyptian history as a second intermediate period by Egyptologists is not only Egyptocentric, but also a totalizing narrative that discounts the geocultural complexity of the Middle Nile region and the ascendancy of Kushite dominance during the 17th and 16th century BCE. And so two things. One, I'm deconstructing, and we'll talk about that more even a little later. I'm deconstructing the notion of the second intermediate period, because the second intermediate period, although historically in the 19th century, it was viewed as a period of Hyksos rule and Hyksos domination, especially at Avaris in Lower Egypt. And at some time, it was even called the Hyksos period before it was renamed by scholars in the early 20th century, the second intermediate period. Yet what I'm contending this afternoon is that the terminology second intermediate period actually suppresses, if you will, it makes invisible the prominence of ancient Kush during this particular time. And not only ancient Kush, but as the Sobeknak inscription informs us, there were other prominent players in the Nile Valley, such as C group Nubians, also people often called the Nahesi, as well as the Magi people. And then we also see that they had contacts as far south and east as Punt on the Horn of Africa. So there was a complexity of cultures, although Kush was the prominent and certainly the largest state in the Middle Nile Valley at this particular time. And so what I'm suggesting is that we revisit the second intermediate period by highlighting the prominence of Kush and not using that term to make Kush invisible. I also want us to look at the Nile Valley, of course, not simply around its neighbor to the north, ancient Egypt, but also the Nile Valley complex, which consisted of ancient Egypt, also called Kemet, in the indigenous language, ancient Kush or Nubia, and then certainly even the cultures in the Horn of Africa. And so this is a powerful quote put out by the Oriental Institute, the Nubian Expedition, some of the earliest work that was done there in the early 60s by Keith Seeley. And here Dr. Bruce Williams gives us insight to how to approach the Nile Valley and Kush in particular. We see Egypt as the prominent civilization, and then somehow ancient Kush or Nubia is simply a replica, if you will, or an impersonator, or a receiver of traditions from ancient Egypt. But actually, we have two poles. We have the northern pole centered in Egypt, and then the southern pole. As with the A group before the Kushite, as with the A group before, the Kushites held the geographical pivot of northeastern Africa. They mixed ideas and materials from the north, Egypt, the east, Pangrave and Magi, in the south to the west, Sudanese Saharan traditions. Since no one could pass by them, they mediated contacts among these groups. At the same time, the A group Kushites tradition remained a major center of lower Nile Valley civilization, having a common origin with Egypt in Nakata 1, Nakata 2. These are pre-dynastic Upper Egyptian polities. The southern group remained more true than Egypt to the archaic heritage that was passed to its descendants at Napata and Merowe. And though modified by continuing contacts with Egypt, was revived in dramatic form by the Nubides in the final pharaonic cemeteries of Kutztool and Balana. So here we see that ancient Kush represented the southern pole of Nile Valley civilization. And not only that, it represented a tradition that maintained archaic Nile Valley traditions, not archaic ancient Egyptian traditions, but archaic Nile Valley traditions and practices, which would be manifested differently in Egypt as well as in Nubia. This is why it is actually more appropriate to talk about the Nile Valley as opposed to a lopsided asymmetrical analysis that holds Egypt as preeminent and then Kush as simply a secondary backwater. This perspective allows the two to be what they were, rivals, contenders, and even at other times, partners and so forth. Not only that, we also see a continuity from the A group kingdom of Kutztool in Lower Nubia, all the way to the A group of the Balana kingdom of the Nubides in the 6th century AD. We have this unbroken continuity from 3200 BCE all the way into the 6th century AD. This is a tradition that lasted very, very long, even after Egypt was conquered by Persians, Greeks, Romans, the Byzantine, and even ultimately the Arabs. Kush continued to be an independent power in the Nile Valley, and certainly this begins at an early date with A group as well as Kerma Kush, as we will see. Not only that, not only is Kush the southern power or southern empire of the Nile Valley, but it is also a Sudanic Sahelian kingdom. The ancient Kushite culture emerged from with McDonald labels as a trans-Saharan pastoral techno complex dating between 3800 and 1000 BC. It is known within the domain of Nubian studies that ancient Kerma and its northern counterpart, C group Nubia, existed in the Middle Nile region from approximately 2500 to 1500 BCE and was contemporary with the old and middle kingdoms of ancient Nubia. Yet equally significant, the ancient kingdom of Kerma was also a part of a Sudanic Sahelian tradition that extended from the Sudan to Mauritania in West Africa. One of the hallmarks of this expansive cultural complex was the construction of earthen mounds that served as both ritual centers and royal tombs. These mound tumuli ranged in date from 4000 BCE to 500 CE and have been discovered in the regions of what are now Chad, Mali, Niger, southern Algeria, Mauritania, and Ghana. Ancient Kush certainly was a Nile Valley civilization, but it was also part of the Sahel zone, the Savannah zone that stretches from Ethiopia into Sudan, all the way into Senegal, Mauritania, Gambia, Mali, and so forth. And we know this because of the certain cultural complex that they shared. Here I mentioned the tumuli that were built at Kerma, as well as tumuli being built in Niger, Mali, and as far west as Senegal. But they also shared a ceramic tradition in common as well. So here we see a map highlighting the Sahel zone. Of course, to the right, we see the Nile Valley. And then as we move toward the left, we move west across Chad, Niger, where you see those spiral circles. Those are places where wavy line pottery or wavy line pottery, ceramics were discovered in the Sudanic and Sahara belt. So archaeologically, we have at least two traditions, an architectural tradition of tumuli building and a ceramic tradition of this wavy line pottery that spread across the Sahel zone from the Sudan all the way into West Africa, substantiating that Kush was also a part of the Saharan and Savannah traditions. The ceramics that were recovered from these sites, they characterize wavy line and dotted wavy line decoration, which form the cornerstone of Mesolithic and Neolithic components along the Central Nile across the Sahara and Sahel belt. Not only that, they formed a model for cultural uniformity for the Nilo-Saharan Sahel belt, and they range from the 8th millennium BCE to the 4th millennium BCE. In the Sudan, some of the major sites of their discovery was at Khartoum Hospital, also known as Early Khartoum, Shahanab, and El Kos. The wavy line and dotted wavy line motifs are widespread in space and time. They cover an area from the Red Sea to Mauritania and from the Eastern Sahara to the Savannah in West Africa. Of course, they date again from the 8th millennium to the 4th millennium BCE, covering a span of 5,300 kilometers east to west and 1,500 kilometers north to south. Again, an area that covers from Senegal to the Red Sea. Also, let me mention very quickly, before I move on to Kutztool and the Kutztool incense burner, is that this is actually another project that I'm working on. The tumuli in West Africa, there are some in northern Senegal that date from 1000 CE, others in the southern Senegal zone, which date from 200 BCE to 100 CE. There's some in the Gorma region of Mali, which date from 900 BCE to 540 BCE, and probably one of the most famous El Walaji tumuli, which is 11th century Mali, which dates during that same period and so forth. So we have a range of tumuli, some which are comparable to the tumuli that were built at Kerma, and even the tumuli that were built in Lower Nubia among the Balana culture of the Nubides and so forth. We see these practices spread across the Sahel. This gives us a different perspective on how we should understand the founding of both Kushite states as well as Egyptian, the Sahel and Savannah perspective. For instance, Dr. Christopher Eric, he says the crucial early innovative areas in the continent lay in the Sudan belt in West Africa. Even with the Niger political history, Egypt's first large state, the Old Kingdom, took shape not at the center, but at one edge of a wider nexus of early complexity that included Saharan pastoralists, Nubian town dwellers, and of course, the Kutztool state. And yet, as undiscovered small states further south in Nubia as well. The major technological turning points of early African history, from the invention of ceramics to the invention of ironworking, did not originate in Egypt, but spread there from other areas, end quote. For so long in Egyptology, and even early Nubiality scholars such as George Reisner attempted to separate both Egypt and Nubia from the rest of Africa, and also make Africa nowhere near connected to the Nile Valley, as if the Nile Valley, Egypt, and Nubia were not on the African continent, suggesting that Egypt was a cul-de-sac or Nubia was a cul-de-sac in the Nile Valley with no type of interaction with the rest of quote unquote Black Africa and so forth. Yet what we see, Dr. Eric makes clear, the ceramic production across the Sahel makes clear, the tumuli production across the Sahel makes clear that the Nile Valley civilizations of both Kush and Egypt did not emerge in a vacuum and did not emerge disconnected from the rest of the African continent. And so rightly so, the foundation of Kustul, we see here, the famous Kustul incense burner was discovered by the expedition team of the Oriental Institute Nubian expedition in the early 60s. And this famous incense burner that they discovered at Cemetery L24, I believe, gave indication that there was a pharaonic monarchy in what is now Lower Nubia before the founding of dynastic Egypt. Certainly that was the case. Let me highlight some of the significance of the Kustul incense burner. It was the earliest complex of easily recognizable pharaonic symbols. And today, Kustul is considered one of the founding centers of dynastic Egyptian civilization, one of 4 centers, in fact, along with Abydos, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis. The Kustul incense burner consists of the earliest representation of the white crown of Upper Egypt in the Middle Nile Valley. The incense burner is the first to depict Horus perched upon the seraph facade, the falcon. It's the first to depict the prominent symbol of sovereignty and kingship during the early dynastic period. It also displays a royal bark procession approaching an imperial palace. And it also is the first to assemble all of these unique pharaonic symbols together on one particular object, as we see here. So and of course, this is a well-known discovery, and when it was first made and released in the early 60s, and then even in the 80s when it was published in prominent archaeology magazines, it caused a lot of controversy because the idea was that, okay, these scholars are arguing that the Egyptian pharaonic civilization did not begin in Egypt, but it began in ancient Nubia. And actually, that was the incorrect way to understand it. What it was really showing us is that Nile Valley civilization and dynastic state formation was indispensably connected, right, to what we now call Lower Nubia and ancient Kush, right? And so the Kustul incense burner reveals that to us. And then not only that, Kustul, as well as the other Upper Egyptian and Kushite states, cannot be considered independent of East Central Africa, the Great Lakes region, or what I've been emphasizing so far in this presentation, the Sahel and the Saharan belt as well, gave birth to what we would see at Kustul in both Kush as well as Upper Egypt. So this leads us to Donald B. Refer's book. I think it's been out maybe 10 years or more now. From Slave to Pharaoh, the Black Experience of Ancient Egypt, right? This is prevalent, this is popular, this perspective, this viewpoint on ancient Kush and Nubia, in this bifurcation of a white Egypt, or at least a non-African Egypt, and then a Black Nubian Kush, and so forth. And then somehow the Kushites were slaves, and then they became pharaohs only in the 25th dynasty of Egypt, right? This is the common perception, right? Yet the evidence suggests otherwise, and certainly the rise of Kush from the first intermediate period to the second intermediate period suggests otherwise. And then, of course, the connections to the Sahara and Sahel belt suggest otherwise as well. So the earliest beginnings of Nubia and Nubians in relation to Egypt, therefore, was as sovereign equals and not slaves. Reference suggests that the study of Nubian history throughout its entire span, along with A Group Nubia and Kerma, is not germane to a book that attempts to situate Napatan history within the context of New Kingdom Egypt without ever establishing the antecedents of Napatan culture in Kerma and the pre-dynastic traditions of Sudanic and Sahelian Africa. Such an approach is historically indefensible and certainly Egyptocentric. And so when we only focus on the so-called Black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, or we only focus on the period of Egyptian conquest of Kerma, as well as Lower Nubia during the New Kingdom with Ahmosis, and then certainly Tutmosis III, who kind of seals the deal for Egyptian conquest of Nubia during the New Kingdom, that 500-year period. But when we begin Kushite history with the Egyptian conquest during the New Kingdom, or only the 25th dynasty, beginning in the late period of Egyptian history, and we ignore Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, we ignore Kerma, we ignore its influence in the Nile Valley, we ignore its connection to the Sahelian and Sahara Belt, as well as the Great Lakes region, then we can put out books that suggest that the Nubians were somehow Black slaves in the Nile Valley only and exclusively. Certainly, Kush was called vile. Certainly, Kush was called wretched. Kush was called wretched and vile in some Egyptian texts because they were a major rival and a major contender. Even in the Sobek Nak inscription that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, the word vile Kush is used. That trope, that motif is used. And certainly because Kush, along with the Magi, along with C Group, along with Punt, have launched an invasion into Egypt. Certainly that is not indicative of a people who are inferior or who are imitators or who are slaves. All right. I want to clarify just very quickly some of the toponyms and ethnonyms for the region known as Cushion Nubia. In Egyptian texts, Nubia was called Wawat, which consisted of Lower Nubia, also called Taseti, which referred to a kingdom in Lower Nubia, translating land of the bow. Taseti was also the first nome in Upper Egypt on the border of Lower Nubia and so forth. In Egyptian texts, Upper Nubia, what is now Upper Nubia, or the Kerma Kush Cataract, 4th, 5th Cataract region was called Yam in Egyptian texts. Other times, the land was also called Ta Nehesi, the Nubian land. Beginning in the 12th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom, the toponym Kush is used, beginning in the 12th dynasty. So Old and Middle Kingdom texts, the territory that we now refer to as Ancient Nubia, or the modern country of the Sudan and even Southern Egypt. These were the terms that were used during the Old and Middle Kingdom in ancient Egyptian literature, from Wawat to Kush. Those are the terms that are used. Another ethnonym that is often used is Nehesi. Egyptologists have translated over the years as Negro. Other times they translated as Black. Other times they translated as Nubian. I'm more inclined to agree with Stuart Tyson Smith, who has recently established that the verbs for the basis of Nehesi or Nehes can mean one, to implore a god, or to bite or sting. There's very little evidence other than the chauvinistic bias of early Egyptologists to translate the word Nehesi as Negro or Black. And even technically, it does not mean Nubian either. It's its own inherent ethnonym. I'm more inclined to accept that it means to implore a god or to bite or sting. Another reason why these translations are interesting to me because this was the trope of the Ethiopians, right? The Greeks called the area now known as, or then known as Kush, Ethiopia. And then the Greeks had tropes and motifs for these people as well. And one of them was they are very devout, very religious. And then number two, they are expert archers and fighters and combatants and wrestlers. And so this translation of Nehesi as one to implore God, to summon a god, or to bite, to sting, in other words, your martial and combative abilities and so forth, seems to be more in line even with later tropes and the reputation of these people during that particular time. Now, the word Nubian itself, there's dispute over, is it based upon the Egyptian word for gold, Nebu, or is it based upon texts that we begin to see, Greek texts that we begin to see in the 3rd century, Aristophanes, and then Strabo quoting Aristophanes, I should say. In those texts, we see the word Nubai used, and then we also see the word Noba used to refer to these people south of the first cataract. The Aksumite stele, Greek stele of Izana also calls the people the Noba. In Coptic text, they are called Anuba, right? So this is the first time we begin to see that particular term. Yet the term Nubian has taken on a general geographic description of what we now call Kush, southern Egypt, or should I say, not just Kush, but Wawat, Lower Nubia, so southern Egypt, or Lower Nubia, and then of course all of Upper Nubia, right? And so oftentimes we see ancient Nubia, Egypt's rival in Africa, or the ancient Nubians, and so forth. And so it has taken on the notion of a generalized geographic description of the entire Nile Valley, although it also refers to a particular ethnic groups that are located in northern Sudan and southern Egypt. So I just want us to understand how we use the terms. I'm going to talk a little bit about Kerma. Kerma is divided into these particular chronological phases. We have a Neolithic culture, pre-Kerma settlement dated between 3,500 and 5,000 BCE. Early Kerma, 2,500 to 2050 BC, which is also known as Kerman Ancients. And then Middle Kerma, also known as Kerma Moyen, and then Kerma Classique. Here I just use the English translation: early Kerma, middle Kerma, and classic Kerma. The period that we're focusing on during the second intermediate period, which I have highlighted in red, pardon me, is primarily dealing with the period of middle Kerma and classic Kerma. So between 2050 BCE and 1580 BCE. What you all see to your right is a bell-shaped Kerma beaker. This was the hallmark of classical Kerma civilization. The Kerma beaker is the most common form of the classic Kerma ware. It's an outgrowth of a long Nilotic tradition of black top red polished ware. And it marked the zenith of ceramic technology in the ancient kingdom of Kerma. This particular beaker was found at the Egyptian site of Abydos. In fact, a number of wares from classic Kerma have been found in that region during the Middle Kingdom, and even some as late as the Early Kingdom. The tombs generally contain both Kerma ceramics as well as Egyptian goods. The fact that this particular ceramic was found in Abydos in Upper Egypt shows the level of interaction and communication, as well as trade and the movement of people at this particular time. Especially this one is particularly dated during the classic Kerma period, this particular ware. Of course, we have to refer to the ancient city of Kerma. Of course, to your left, this is the Western Defufa. This was a mud brick or adobe temple that was at the center of the town of Kerma. And then to your right, what you see is a scale model of what the city looked like, put out by Charles Bonnet and the Swiss Archaeology Mission in Sudan. The kingdom of Kerma was the largest of the second intermediate period states. So during the second intermediate period, and you'll see a map as we move forward, you have a states in the north at Avars, both the 14th and 15th dynasties at Avars. Then you have Upper Egyptian dynasties, the Thebans, 16th, 17th dynasties in particular. And then you have, of course, polities in northern Nubia, the Magi, as well as C group and so forth. And then Kerma Kush. The largest of these states, the largest of these polities at this time in the Nile Valley was the kingdom of Kerma. At its peak, it stretched from the first to the fifth cataract, covering over 1,000 kilometers. In fact, Charles Bonnet remarks of this period that the kingdom of Kerma is without a doubt the prominent civilization of the valley of the Nile, end quote. Right. Which, you know, in researching this, which was very curious to me, this is not anything that's original. I mentioned William Vivian Davies, of course, Charles Bonnet, Dominique Vibal, Laszlo Tarak. All of these scholars are familiar with this particular period and the prominence of Kerma during this time. And so it just begs the question, why does the image of the 25th dynasty of Kush continue to persist in the popular imagination of a time when Kush had prominence in the Nile Valley, when clearly during this period, this was the most prominent of the Nile Valley states during the classic Kerma period. Not only that, the Defufa that we see here to the left, again, I've indicated that it was a temple towering over 25 meters high in that city at that particular time. And even when you look at the model produced by the Swiss mission in the Sudan, you see in the center of the town, that building is the Defufa. So it was surrounded, of course, by different compounds, smaller villages. And one of the things that really is marked about this, if you look very closely, and this is something, again, that I've heard Dr. Bonnet say, not only reading his work, but also meeting him at Nubia Studies conferences, is that much of the architecture at Kerma was distinct, and some of it was reminiscent of West African styles in particular. Some of the hut buildings, as well as the circular structures with conical thatch roofs, 3-column structures holding it up, are reminiscent of structures seen in Cameroon and Nigeria and other places in West Africa. Suggesting again that Kerma was indeed not only a Nile Valley civilization, but also a part of the Saharan and Sahelian belt. In the biography of Uni Harkuf expeditions, there is mention of Nubian nations and Nubian ethnicities. And both of these texts, who they mention a federation of various Nubians. In the biography of Uni, he mentions the Urjet Nubians, the Magi Nubians, Yam Nubians, Wawat Nubians, and the Kau Nubians. We also, technically, if we follow the Old Kingdom text, it also could be the Urjet, Nehesi, the Magi, Nehesi, the Yam, Nehesi, Wawat, Nehesi, Kau, Nehesi, and so forth. And the Harkuf expedition is same, a confederation of Nubians are mentioned. So what you all see to the right is an image of Nubian soldiers dated to the Middle Kingdom, 11th dynasty, found in the area of Asut. And then the image to the right at the bottom is a stele of a Nubian soldier called Nenu. After the collapse of the Old Kingdom and during the civil war between the Thebans and the Heracleopolitans during the first intermediate period, Wawat Nubian soldiers figured prominently in the military of both factions. The Ghibelline Nubian mercenaries fought on the side of Heracleopolis, but Nubian warriors also fought on the side of the Theban armies, and they were greatly utilized and deployed by both Pharaoh Intef II as well as Mentuhotep II. The stele of Nenu, again, this is the one on the bottom right, is another stele from the area called Ghibelline, which was an area where it was a contingency of Nubian mercenaries who had fought during the first intermediate period civil wars. This particular stele provides the life of a Nubian soldier during the early 11th dynasty. The stele presents the archer Nenu and his Egyptian wife, Sekator. The scene also highlights Nenu's son, daughter, and servant, along with hunting dogs. Nenu wears Nubian attire, as well as his son, daughter, and servant. His wife is depicted wearing a white Egyptian dress. Nenu's stele demonstrates the extent to which Nubian soldiers integrated into Egyptian society, intermarried with Egyptian women. In fact, intermarriage was common between Egyptians and Nubians, and such families represented the bicultural and interethnic relationships that contributed to shaping the culture of Upper Egypt and Lower Nubia during the first intermediate period and the Middle Kingdom. Nenu represents a distinct Egypto-Nubian culture in Egypt and Lower Nubia that was pervasive in shaping the political life of both the first intermediate period up until the rule of Kush during the second intermediate period. The culture was forged by, again, C group, Magi, Kerma, Nehesi, people that inhabit those regions. And so the Nubian soldiers were very prominent. In fact, during the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian military adopted Nubian military attire. And even the hieroglyphic sign for soldier or army takes its iconography from a Nubian warrior representing a kneeling man with a bow and an arrow and feather on his head. In fact, Egyptian soldiers of the Middle Kingdom adapted the warrior uniform and regalia of Nubian warriors, thus appropriating Nubian martial culture and combat. Again, this would persist from the first intermediate period well into through the Middle Kingdom up until the second intermediate period. The Egypto-Nubian pharaohs, the 11th and 12th dynasty, we have Mentuhotep II, Nebhetpatra, and then Amenhotep I. Both are founders of dynasties. Mentuhotep II is the founder of the 11th dynasty, and Amenhotep I is the founder of the 12th dynasty. In the funerary temple complex of Nehepetra Mentuhotep II and El Del Bahari, 6 burial shrines were uncovered at the temple of Hathor, comprised of Nubian women who served as Hathor priestesses. 5 of the 6 women were also identified as wives of Mentuhotep. One of the queens, identified as Ashayet, was portrayed on her sarcophagus as a dark brown woman, as were her companions, Queen Kemset and Queen Kawit. So Mentuhotep, his wives, 6, these women were Nubian women. Not only were they Nubian women, but they were also priestess of Hathor, and were buried in his royal complex alongside with him. My colleague, Dr. Solange Ashby, who's actually a part of this Nubian lecture series, has done more detailed research on that particular area. And then, of course, we have Amenhotep I, who too was a part of this Egyptian or Egypto-Nubian cultural milieu. And this is how we must situate both Mentuhotep II as well as Amenhotep I. Amenhotep is famous for the prophecy of Nefertiti, where the text explicitly states that a king will come from the south, Ameni, the son of a woman of Taseti, child of Upper Egypt. The prophecy is communicating that not only is Amenhotep I the prophesied savior who will restore the 2 lands, but he is also an Egyptian of Nubian ethnic heritage from Upper Egypt. So the prophecy of Nefertiti announces that Amenhotep, who actually served in the administration of Mentuhotep IV, so he was not of royal blood or the royal family. He was actually a soldier who worked his way through the ranks during the regime or reign of Mentuhotep IV. I'm referring to Amenhotep I. And one of the ways to legitimize his rule in founding the 12th dynasty was the prophecy of Nefertiti. What's peculiar about it is that it connects the restoration of the 2 lands with the son of a woman from Taseti in particular, saying that he will be the next savior. Now, of course, we also have to deal with the fortresses that were built in Lower Nubia, beginning with Amenhotep I, his successor, Senwerset I, and then Senwerset III, would build all the major fortresses in Lower Nubia. Now, there's discussion about why was the 12th dynasty pharaohs building these fortresses? What was the purpose of these fortresses? And I have them listed from north to south. So if you look on the map to the right, there's the fortress of Buhin, which is the furthest north, and then Simna South is the furthest south. In fact, 15 fortresses were built in Lower Nubia during the 12th dynasty. Most of the fortresses were built during the reign of Senwerset I, extending from Ikur or Kuban in the north to Buhin. The greatest concentration of the fortresses were located in the Simna Gorge, which was the most critical region for defending the border between Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia against the advances of the Kingdom of Kush. A review of the toponymy for the fortresses of this region, Shelfak, Oronati, Simna West, Simna South, and Kumna, reveals the defensive purposes of these structures. Shafak was referred to conquer the foreign countries, and Uranadi was called repelling the Intu, referring to a Nubian people associated with the Magi. And Simna South carried the title subduing the Seti or the Bowland. And Kumna was designated as repelling the bows. And so oftentimes the fortress building of the 12th dynasty is interpreted as an act of colonization, an act of subduing Lower Nubia. What I suggest is that the primary purpose was defensive, to secure the southern frontier against Kerma. Certainly trade, these fortresses were also used for trade, surveillance of the Sea group, the Hesse people, and then certainly to annex gold mining. And then the control of the Nile. These are different reasons, these are different functions of how the fortresses were used. But the impetus for the construction of these fortresses during the 12th dynasty was to defend against the kingdom of Kush and its alliances with the polities of Wawa. What I think is that the Sobak Nak inscription is what we began with. And in that inscription, he describing his war, his fight against a Kushite federation, was a persistent threat. His inscription is 17th dynasty, so it's late second intermediate period. And yet that was a threat and preoccupation. We see even during the 12th dynasty, this was a persistent threat. But these fortresses would begin to be built during the 12th dynasty because that marked the time period where Kush could very well could have advanced and taken over. I shouldn't say take over, but advanced and attempted to conquer Lower Nubia and Upper Egypt sooner than the period of the 17th dynasty and the second intermediate period. And so what we see, what's going on here is that the invasion that Sobak Nak describes could have happened not in the 17th dynasty, it could have happened even in the 12th dynasty or late 11th dynasty. And the fortresses were built to prevent what Sobak Nak describes in his inscription, a Kushite federation invading Egypt. And Reiholt's work, the political situation in Egypt during the second intermediate period, 13th dynasty, ruled by Amenhotep IV, 14th dynasty, which is a very interesting dynasty, Canaanite dynasty, 15th dynasty, the Hekakasu or the Hyksos, 16th dynasty, Theban, the 17th dynasty. The 16th and 17th dynasty, of course, will give birth to the famous 18th dynasty, the dynasty that ultimately expels the Hyksos from northeastern Egypt and establishes the new kingdom, right? The 16th and 17th dynasty, of course, leads to that 18th dynasty. These particular dynasties are referred to as the second intermediate period. The second intermediate period was coined by British Egyptologists at the turn of the 20th century. Previous periods, it was simply known as the Hyksos period. And then in the early 20th century, scholars began to call it the second intermediate period because of the diversity, realizing that Hyksos was just one of many key players. Right? We had the Hyksos, the 14th dynasty, which I think is an understudied dynasty in the popular imagination of Egyptology in particular, because we mostly pay attention to the 15th dynasty and the Hyksos, right? But their predecessors, the 14th dynasty, was also a Canaanite dynasty and an Egyptianized Canaanite dynasty that had been present in Egypt for quite some time from the southern Levant, whereas the 15th dynasty Hyksos were more from the northern region of the Levant and so forth. So those two particular dynasties being based at Avaris, 14th and 15th dynasty, but they were not the only players. Of course, the Thebans, and then of course the Kushite confederation of both Kush, and then all the polities of Lower Nubia or Northern Nubia in Wawat. We know about the 14th, 15th dynasties because of scarab sealed impressions. They were of particular importance for the study of the second intermediate period. The production and use of royal scarab seals or impressions flourished under the 13th dynasty, and then they were adopted by the rulers in the 14th and 15th dynasty at Avaris. The study of the scarab typology became the primary means for establishing the chronological order of the Avaris kings in particular. One particular king during this period that interests me, who was a king in the 14th dynasty, who took on the name Nehesi, whose mother was a Kushite queen and whose father was a Canaanite king. So Nehesi was the child of a diplomatic marriage between both Kush and the Canaanite kings who ruled Lower Nubia and during the 14th dynasty at Avaris. The second intermediate period, this particular king also erected monuments at Avaris as well. The direct, intense relation between the kingdom of Avaris and the rulers of Kush. So one of the things we see going on during the second intermediate period is that there is a diplomatic alliance between the kingdom of Kush and both the 14th dynasty, the Canaanite dynasty, as well as the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos. There is a diplomatic arrangement. In other words, they are working together, especially for trade and commerce. I would imagine so because the northern part of Egypt, of course, provided access to the entire Mediterranean world, and so the Kush would have needed that relationship to move its goods and trade items into the Mediterranean world, and then vice versa. The kings at Avaris, both the 14th dynasty and the 15th dynasty, Hyksos, would have needed Kush for all of the trade routes that connect the Nile Valley to both the Western Sahel and Sahara, as well as across the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean diaspora and so forth. And so these two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of the Hyksos and the Canaanite kings of the 14th dynasty, in diplomatic alliance with Kush. The early second minute period, direct and intense relationship between the rulers of Kush and Avaris at this time are mentioned in the stele of Kamosis and are attested by finds of Lower Egyptian pottery in Kerma cemeteries and in Lower Nubian fortresses. This evidence is supported by seals with the names of Asiatic rulers, as well as Avaris or Canaanite designs found in Kerma contexts in Nubia. So what we see here is that there's archaeological evidence, not only sources, literary sources, but archaeological evidence to demonstrate the connections between the kingdoms at Avaris and the kingdoms of Kush. Primarily seals, Avaris seals being discovered at Kerma. So this is a map of the Nile Valley during the second intermediate period. Again, we see, even on this map, it has the 15th dynasty Hyksos. It completely does not mention the 14th dynasty of Canaanites. It mentions the 16th dynasty, the Theban dynasty, and then you see the kingdom of Kush to the south, right? These were the major polities and states during the second intermediate period. And of course, Kush was the largest of the second intermediate states, and certainly the most influential. and powerful at the time. The image to the right is simply an image of the expulsion of the Hyksos because of the war that Kamoses would fight, and then certainly his successors, Ahmosis, as well, in the founding of the 18th dynasty, ultimately pushes the 15th dynasty Hyksos out of the Nile Valley. Moses III would come in and say, well, we have to deal with Kush too. It's not enough to control Lower Nubia. We see the power of this state. So Moses III extends Egyptian influence for the first time in Nile Valley history. Egypt extends its political influence and power and reign as far south as the 4th and 5th Cataracts regions. This occurs under Moses III during the New Kingdom. During the second intermediate period, there are Egyptian officials who were stationed at the fortresses in Lower Nubia, who during that time when Kush takes control over Lower Nubia and the fortresses in that region, these Egyptian officials are now working and are in service of Kush. Right. So this particular stele of the official Ka during the Kerma Classic or Classic Kerma period, 17th dynasty, he says, I was a valiant servant of the ruler, or Heka of Kush. I washed my feet in the waters of Kush. In the following of the ruler of Nejeh, I returned safe and sound in my family too. So here we have an example of an Egyptian official who's saying he is now working in service of the Kushite king during this particular time. Wow, why isn't it? Okay. I'm just having a problem with for some reason it's acting. Okay. I have just 2 more slides, and it's not moving forward. I don't know why. Let me try this again.
Would you like to wrap up just without use of the slides, and then we can move on to questions?
Yeah. I mean,
That's very strange.
that is strange. Let me just, I'm going to try one more time. Or maybe I can just do it. Is that clear?
Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah, that'll do. I don't want to go back to the full screen in May. The stele of the commander of Buhin, Sepedhor. Again, I was a valiant commander of Buhin. No previous commander has done what I have done. I built a temple to Horus, Lord of Buhin, to the satisfaction of the Prince of Kush. Right. So we see that these officials are now in service of Kush in Lower Nubia and Upper Egypt. The famous Kamoses stele. In this stele, basically he's saying, look, we have to fight and free Egypt. In the north, the Hyksos are ruling us, and in the south, Kush is ruling us. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, that's not exactly what it says, but I know we have to wrap it up. And so in this stele, he's basically saying that these 2 powers have taken over Egypt and their respective regions in the Nile Valley, right? And so we have to fight and resist them and so forth. Certainly the Asiatics, but also Nubia, who has a possession of Egypt as well, right? So it's clear that in the 17th dynasty, Nubia was a prominent power. Kush was a prominent power in the Nile Valley. And then, of course, the famous Kamo second stele, where it alleges that he intercepted a letter from the king of the Hyksos of Pepi. And in this letter, the king of the Hyksos is asking the king of Kush for assistance to fight against the Thebans, right? And so what we have here, again, is an example of Hyksos and Kushite collaboration to maintain power in this particular letter. And in the letter, the Hyksos king says, come north, do not hold back. See, he is here with me. There is none who will stand up to you in Egypt. So this representation is suggesting that Kush is formidable because the king of the Hyksos is saying that no one in Egypt can stand up to you. So come help us, assist us. I will not give him way out until you arrive. Then we shall divide the towns of Egypt, and Kent-Hanefer shall be in joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Faraji, for that really interesting and really informative presentation of your work. We have several questions that have come in from the audience. If you would give us a few more moments to answer some of them, we'd appreciate it. So to just jump into the questions, one from Carl Walsh is asking, are the West African tumuli you mentioned similar in their construction techniques to the Kerma tumuli? And where have they been published?
Yes. Now again, let me say this. I can't speak and make a blanket statement because there are thousands in Mali and Senegal. And there are variations, and not all of them were built during the same time period. I think the earliest is 900 BCE, and then the latest may be the 11th century AD. And then they range from Senegal to Mali, even to northern Nigeria. But two scholars that I mentioned are both Africanist archaeologists, Kevin McDonald, and then Susan McIntosh has done some work, I think, in the earlier mid-90s or so forth on this. This is just very, when I discovered this, is very exciting to me. And it also told me one thing, another thing as well, is that Africanist archaeologists, we have to be in dialogue. I know we have our disciplines, but we compartmentalize our knowledge and disciplines. So Nubiologists and Egyptologists aren't talking to Africanists, and then vice versa. And these West African tumuli have been known about since, let's say, by the Western world. I'll say that by the Western world since the 19th century, when the French, during the colonial era, colonizing West Africa and creating French West Africa and the Upper Volta, they were very aware of these tumuli and have begun to survey them and even excavate some of them as well.
That's great. I want to echo that call for more communication and collaboration. Hopefully having things online like this and the increased connectivity now that we all have, I mean, due to the global pandemic, maybe will actually help help with that, and it might be one nice outcome. Okay, lots of questions are coming in, so let me just move on to the next one. Christine Hasdorf, from the director of the Archaeological Research Facility, has a couple of questions about sort of subsistence and cultural practices. And so two, I'll just put them together. One is, did they use musical instruments that we associate with this region today, such as the oud and the kora? And the other is, if you can comment on Nubian foodways and subsistence. Are they farmers along the Nile, or elsewhere? And do they eat in the style of the Sahelian and or Nilotic foods? Do they use ovens or griddles or both?
Wow, great question. Some of it may be beyond my beyond my expertise. The first question about musical instruments, and she mentioned that. I love the korab, by the way. I love the sound of that instrument in Mali and Senegambia and so forth. I'm not sure. I know some of the similarities. Monarchs were buried in these tumuli as the tumuli in the Nile Valley in Kerma Kush. They were also buried with their weaponry, as in Kerma Kush. They were also buried with insignia. They are also buried with certain food items, ceramics, and so forth, similar to Kerma Kush as well. And then the structure of them are also similar, not identical, because each region had its own topographical variations and so forth. In terms of the food ways, I really can't speak directly to that, beyond a more generalized level of the Nile having an agricultural basis, certainly. But yet at the same time, pastoral and nomadic lifestyles also coming in as well from the West, and these two lifestyles existing side by side in formation of Kerma Kush. I know the city of Kerma, as early as 3500 BCE, you see this kind of proto-urbanization happening. Well before Kerma in its heyday, during the Middle and Classic Kerma periods and so forth. Mm-hmm. So of course, agriculture to support a city, like the model I showed you all from the Swiss expedition, to support a city, you had to be rooted in it.
Well, for perhaps to find further information on those topics, someone actually asked, can you recommend any succinct readings for undergraduates on Nile Valley material culture, especially connections to West African material culture?
Wow. A lot of what I was drawing on today came from Charles Bonnet's work for undergrads. What else? I mean, so much of it is technical in terms of it's still in the realm of archaeologists and so forth. But Charles Bonnet's work. I have a colleague who just finished his PhD at the University College of London, UCL, who wrote his dissertation on this topic, but he focused primarily on Nigeria. His name is Dr. Andrew Jaggs. So he's done similar work that I can think of right offhand. And then certainly I mentioned Susan McIntosh and I mentioned Kevin McDonald's work. You may want to look at that. My book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity, I spend far more time and detail on this topic as well. I do have sections on my book that deal with this.
Great, thank you. Gilda Ferrandino has said, thank you so much for your interesting talk, and is asking about the ethnonym Nubian. According to the most recent studies of C. Riley, the word derives from the Meroitic word NOB, found in Meroitic texts. I don't know if I said that correctly, but I guess that's sort of more of a comment than a question, if you want to.
I mean, certainly. I've met Dr. Riley. I'm familiar with his work. I'm certain that is plausible. I even suspect. I mean, I'm a historian, and then I focus on archaeology and anthropology and some linguistic as well. But I even suspect that although the word in terms of Greek text shows up in the 3rd century, when we look at the material culture, especially around the funerary practices and the burial practices of late antique Nubia, the Nubides in particular, we see practices that extend back to the Meroitic period. And we also see practices that extend back to the Kushite Kerma period as well. So it could be that that particular term in Greek text, the Nuba or the Noba, is actually referring to the same people who lived and existed in Kush during the Kerma period as well as the Meroitic period. So what I'm saying is maybe it's a different name for those people that persisted from that time period. And so Riley's work showing a Meroitic origin, I mean, that sounds plausible to me. I really can't comment it beyond that because I don't specialize in the Meroitic language, but certainly that sounds like that could be a plausible take on the origin of the word.
Okay. And to wrap up, one more question from Solange Ashby, who says, I would love to hear more about the 14th dynasty king Nehesi from Avaris. This multi-ethnic ruler needs to be better known.
Yes, he does. He built, I say he in fact, of the 14th dynasty kings, the reason why he's known is because he's the only one that built monumental structures in the region of Avaris. And certainly he represents the diplomatic alliance between Kush and the Canaanite kings in the 14th dynasty. A very, very interesting figure. In fact, I mentioned that I think the 14th dynasty doesn't get as much acknowledgement as the famous 15th dynasty of the Hyksos. But I think it's even more important for understanding Egypt's connection to the Levant in particular. Right? Those polities that from Syria to Jordan and everything else in between, Israel, Palestine, and so forth. And so the 14th dynasty is very interesting, a very fascinating period. And I think it explains a lot. I think it even explains some of what we see in the biblical narrative as well, in terms of why there's such a prominent role. And I know that's not my lecture, that's my colleague who will come later. But why we see such a prominent valorization of Cush in the Hebrew Bible. Cush is placed in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2. Moses is married to a Cushite, and then we see Cushites being sought for refuge in Chronicles and Kings. Taharka is mentioned. And I think the 14th dynasty helps explain a lot of that, as opposed to just looking exclusively at the Hyksos in the 15th dynasty.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Faraji, I'm afraid we're out of time, excuse me, but I would like to thank you on behalf of the Badè Museum and the Archaeological Research Facility, both at Pacific School of Religion and UC Berkeley, for sharing these new perspectives on ancient Kerma and ancient Nubia, and for kicking off this lecture series. Thank you for your talk and for your time. And we look forward to hearing further perspectives once a month, all the way through June. So on behalf of the Berkeley community, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we look forward to further events in the future.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to the other lecturers as well in this series. So appreciate you all hosting and organizing.